Hey, good morning, everybody. This is Greg Christensen at Grandview Grain and Livestock. I was just out here feeding hay. Um, Sometimes maybe you feel like you get a bad rap if you feed hay. Maybe you feel like you're not a good grazer because you're out there feeding hay in the wintertime. And I wanted to give you a few of my thoughts on hay. And I figured this up quite a while ago, and then I watched a video, and I'll put a link to it in the description. But it only confirmed what I was already figuring out for myself, is that you can't make a blanket statement and say that you shouldn't feed hay, or hay's too costly, or that you're going to go broke if you feed hay, or you're just putting money in someone else's pocket. The rest of the story is that depends. And it sounds like an economist, but that's what you got to be if you're raising livestock and figuring your expenses and your income. Because if you feed hay, you have to buy that hay or put a value on that hay. If you graze stockpile, well, one thing you got to do is cut your stocking rate back to allow to grow that stockpile there in August, September, maybe even November. And so you've got to take into account the value of those calves or goats or sheep that you're not raising, because you cut your stocking rate back to afford to grow some stockpile to graze through the winter. So you really need to know your cost. You really need to know, how much are you making on your livestock versus how much your hay's costing it. Because if hay's relatively inexpensive, and you'll have to be the judge of that, you'll have to plug that in. But if you can buy hay for $30 a bale, $40 a bale, maybe even $50, depending on how big the bales are, maybe that would be $60, $70, maybe $80 a ton. There's times it may be worth it. If you've got livestock that are worth enough to offset those costs because you can carry more of them. For instance, if the goat and sheep market is high and you figure you can carry, I don't know, let's just say 25% more sheep or goats if you didn't grow the stockpile, and then you would have to feed some hay in the winter. So you can figure that out and you can figure out how much you have to have and how much you can pay for that hay. If you're raising cattle right now, the economics of it probably depend on the hay cost in your neighborhood. It's probably not economically efficient to feed a lot of hay. Especially, you probably don't want to feed 150, 120 days. You get that down, you might feed maybe 90 days, 60 days. You have to look at that, the economics of each one of those. And that's what, the fellow from Kentucky University, and I'll put a link to that, but that's what he's figured out. And usually about the most economical of what he showed with cattle prices the way they are would be maybe feeding, I think it was 90 days of hay, maybe, possibly. Because, you got something else besides just the cost of the hay. You got the nutrients involved. When you put the hay out to the pasture, the nutrients get spread on your pasture. Your animals consume it. They spread the nutrients on your pasture. Folks, I don't think you can just make a blanket statement and say, hey, you can't feed hay, or hey, if you feed hay, you're going to go broke. It's just not that way. It's not that simple. It's not that cut and dried. It's like everything in the livestock business. There's a whole lot of variables come into play, and you need to figure those out. You need to know your cost, what it costs for hay. You need to know what you're making per animal. You need to know your pasture cost. But just don't feel like if you're feeding hay, you're a bad grazer, or maybe you're not making as much money as somebody else that might be feeding hay, because that's quite possibly not so. I mean, especially if you're raising sheep and goats, it's probably beneficial to stock heavier, not grow as much stockpile as you possibly could, but raise more animals. I mean, when the goat market's at $3 a pound, that probably makes more sense. Of course, you still want to buy your hay as cheaply as possible, but don't buy cheap hay. You know, the nutrients in your hay, you can afford to pay quite a bit more if you sit down and figure it out for hay that is, let's say, 10% protein than hay that is 5 or 6. Because it's going to take you the same amount of time. You're going to have to feed more bales of the lower quality hay. You're going to have to feed a supplement probably with that. If you've got nannies that are coming up to kidding in 4 or 5 weeks, they're going to need more than that 5 or 6% protein hay. So buy good hay when you're going to buy it. If you got the chance, get a test on it. Test your own hay. I know my hay this year was the worst quality it's ever been. We had so much rain, some of it got rained on, but some of it was just so diluted with the moisture that was in the grass that it's really not very good quality. But I wanted you to be aware that, hey, you know, if you're out there and you're feeding hay, don't feel like you're a failure as a grazer. There's sometimes very good reason that you can make more money that somebody is feeding hay or is not feeding hay all the time now. Now we're having to feed with this tractor right now because it's muddy out here. And yeah, I wouldn't mind having some stockpile out here, but just moving the fence. But we didn't plan on it being this muddy. It's not usual for us to be this muddy in the winter. This tractor we also use for the cropping enterprise. We pull a grain cart, pull a drill. So it's not really just for livestock here. We happen to have it on hand. So that you got to take that into consideration too. What do you have available that you can feed hay with? Can you feed hay if the weather gets bad? Or maybe you want to feed hay when the weather's good and you can get out there and keep them off some of that and save some of the stockpile that you have for times when the weather's not as good, it's muddy, you can't get out there, or maybe even that you're going to be gone for a while and you can give them that. So there's really, I just cringe when I hear people say, hey, you can't feed hay and you're going to go broke if you feed hay. No, there's sometimes very good reasons to feed hay, so keep that in mind. This is Greg Christensen, Grandview Grain and Livestock. Thanks for watching, and if you like this, subscribe and hit the like button, and I can tell who and how many's out there. Thanks.